Welcome back! If you're just joining the series, you may consider watching the setup video so you're ready to keep coding and learning. In this video, we will learn about CSS properties and layout patterns useful for styling content, such as for a blog, including how to center website content, about special selectors, how margin collapsing works, how to use Inspector to help create definitions for complex properties like linear gradient, and how to make a circular image with one line of CSS. Check the video description for a link to an article with the video transcript and code samples from this lesson. You may want to refer back to the first lesson that created our initial blog HTML, Episode 5. To begin this lesson, open our project in VS Code. If you are just joining us, you can download the starter project to catch up. See the link in the video description. In the terminal, type the command npm run start to run the project. Open blog-layout.html in VS Code and organize your screen to be split with the browser. Then, update the browser URL to include /blog-layout.html. Now, this page may seem a little shocking at this point, since it is inheriting all of our styles due to linking to our single style.css file. We're no longer benefiting from that, so let's create a new CSS file called blog-layout.css. Then, in our HTML file, update the style sheet link in the head from style.css to blog-layout.css and save. Now we're back to default browser styles. We'll first create a rule for body with font family sans serif and color hex code 222. I chose the color value of 222 because an off black is recommended as a little easier on the eyes when reading long-form content like a blog post. Next, let's adjust our typographic scale, which means the size assigned to each typography element. Before that, let's temporarily comment out the image so we can focus on the type. For the type, we'll do something similar to what we originally defined in style.css, including a rule to reset the margins. But we'll reduce our rules to cover H1 through H3 for this demo. For the margin rule, the selector will be for H1, H2, and H3, with the definition margin 0, 0, 0.35 em. For our H1, we'll set font size to 40 pixels, H2 font size 28 pixels, and H3 font size 20 pixels. Looking at our page, it feels like the spacing is a little off around the paragraphs. Let's try adding a margin definition for P with margin 0, 0, 1.15 em. That feels a little better, but let's duplicate each paragraph and then remove some words out of each one to mimic real text a bit more. Then save and let's review. It looks nice between paragraphs, but it would be nice to use a bit more space to emphasize the sections created by use of the H2. For this, we could use a class, but that would require remembering to use the class each time we added in H2. Instead, we can use the adjacent sibling selector, which is the plus sign, to select H2 that follow paragraphs and create the following rule. P plus H2 with margin top 1.5 em. Save. Then with Inspector, we can see that there is only margin top on the second H2 because it is the only one following a paragraph. Inspector also helps us see a few other interesting things about how the margin top was applied. First, since we use the relative em unit, the space is equal to 1.5 times 28 pixels, since the font size of the H2 is set to 28 pixels, which on the Computed tab, we can see becomes 42 pixels. But wait, Isn't there a margin bottom on every paragraph? If we inspect the paragraph prior to the H2, we see there is a computed margin bottom of 18.4 pixels. And then if we hover the H2, we see its margin top extends to the bottom of the paragraph, not to the bottom of the paragraph's margin. This is due to a particular behavior of margins, which is called collapsing. Competing margins collapse into each other, with the smaller margin being collapsed into the larger margin. To emphasize this behavior, let's add a temporary style to the paragraph using the element.style section in Inspector to add margin bottom 60 pixels to create a margin that we know is larger than the top margin on the H2. Inspecting both, we now see that the paragraph margin is the value being used to create the space instead of the H2s. The takeaway here is that if you have set equal margins on two bordering elements, like 16 pixels, the space will not be double the value at 32 pixels, but rather collapse to be 16 pixels total. You can refresh the page to clear the element style rule. With our window half width, we're missing the whole picture we have with our layout. So let's extend both VS Code and the browser back to full width, and then move beyond typography. Open blog layout, HTML, and VS Code, and let's review our structure. Our primary containing elements are header, main, and footer. Let's go ahead and remove the HR we added in the HTML lesson, since we'll replace it with CSS. With the browser window full width, it's clear that our layout is aligned to the screen left, which makes sense as all the containing elements are block elements, and we learned previously that that's their default behavior. But you have likely noticed from viewing other websites that there is generally a max width set for the main content area, and the main content area is centered in the browser window. Switch back to our CSS file and let's add a new rule with a selector for header, main, and footer, and definitions for max width, 800 pixels, margin left auto, and margin right auto. Save, and you'll see our content now appears more centered. If we inspect, you can see that's the result of adding the auto margins. The auto keyword is unique to margin and tells the browser to compute the value of extra space. We've used it on both sides, so it's effectively pushed our containers to the center. Using Inspector, you can toggle off the margin right definition and then see how the remaining margin left auto rule has caused the containers to slide all the way to the right side. However, if we test toggling off the max width rule, there is no extra space left around each element, which eliminates the centering behavior. This is looking good, but we want our header to stand out more. So let's add a rule. For header, with background color Rebecca Purple, color FFF, which is white, and padding 24 pixels. Save, and you may agree that's not quite the effect we were going for. It would be nice if the background color stretched across the window, but we placed our max width rule on the header directly, so it's limiting the width of the background as well. It's time to introduce a utility class to handle the width and centering. So let's change that rule to use the selector for a class called container and save. Let's also move the padding rule from header into the container class. Unlike margin, padding does not collapse since it's inside the element it's defined on. This will help create visual space between our elements. Then, in our HTML, we'll make 3 adjustments. First, wrap the content of header and footer with a div and include the container class. Inside main, we already have the child element of article, so we can add the container class to that, then save and review. That's more like it, but there's still a bit of leftover space. Using Inspector to explore, we find that margin on body is the culprit. So on the body rule, let's add the definition margin 0 and save. Now let's add a new rule to the footer. With the selector footer and border top, 2 pixels, solid Rebecca purple. Save, and hold on, that did more than we wanted it to. There's now also a border within our block quote, which also contains a footer element. We could create a utility class to apply a border, but for purposes of this lesson, let's use the child combinator selector, which is the right caret, and means to select only elements that are a direct child of the qualifying selector. We'll modify our selector to body, the child combinator selector, footer, and save. Now the footer that is nested within block quote is unaffected by this rule. Speaking of our block quote, let's give him some styling love too. It can be helpful to use the Element Style section to try out new styles before you commit to them in your style sheet, and also to take advantage of the helpers provided by the browser. So let's select the block quote and try it. Add background, and then if we begin to type linear-gradient, the browser not only autocompletes, but provides a default value. For things like gradients, developing in the browser is extra useful because the syntax is trickier than your average definition. Instead of the pure black the browser defaulted to, let's update to a softer value that's a tint of Rebecca purple. To figure out that value, let's inspect header and open the color picker, and slide the picker icon at roughly a 45-degree angle toward the top left until it's on a really light purple. Click on the generated hex value and copy it. Don't worry about reverting the header value since we're focusing on the block quote right now. Return to the block quote and update the value of black in the linear gradient to the value you copied. The value I selected is EDDBFF. We can now copy the background definition and move it to our style sheet, where we'll add a few more properties to complete the rule. We'll add color Rebecca purple, margin left 0 and margin right 0 to remove the default browser styles, padding 1em, and border radius 4 pixels. Very nice. We're almost done, but we need to deal with our image, so let's uncomment that to add it back in. Let's also update the source URL to drop the X150, which was added in error in the HTML lesson. The main issue here is lack of space between the image and the surrounding content. Now, we want a rule that won't affect every image we may add to the site, just left-aligned images in our articles. We also committed an error in our HTML lesson, which was done purely because we hadn't learned CSS yet. That error was using the align attribute, which is actually what is called deprecated. Deprecation means it used to be a valid attribute, but it is no longer recommended, and support for it could be dropped in future browser versions, so we shouldn't rely on it. Instead, let's create a utility class. We'll call it image-align-left, with the first definition of float left, which replaces the style previously inherited by the browser. And then, to give it the space, we'll use margin 0, 16 pixels, 16 pixels, 0, which will give it a right and bottom margin of 16 pixels. Then, on the image HTML, remove the align attribute and replace it with the class attribute with our class of image-align-left. Save, and it's looking better with the margin added to give it some breathing room. Let's add one more property for visual flair and use border-radius 50% and save. You can see that the image now appears as a circle. 50% is a special value that can produce a circle, but only on square elements. If the element is not square, it will begin to have a more oval appearance. Our use of the Place Corgi service is returning a 200 pixel square image, which mimics an image that you may add into your blog from a CMS such as WordPress, where you could also define precise dimensions, therefore ensuring a square base image. We'll explore different methods of ensuring visually consistent image sizes in our capstone project. Finally, let's update our margin to actually use a negative value instead of 0 for the margin left. So the definition becomes 0, 16 pixels, 16 pixels, negative 20 pixels, and save. This allows it to tuck into the space created by the padding defined by container class, but not extend out beyond the boundary of the article. Stay tuned for the next video where we will style a card layout. Be sure to subscribe. Support this project on Patreon. The link is in the video description.